was one of the topics which came under scrutiny. The 10-ton giant is airborne. It was front-page news from the scene of Britain's worst train disaster.
War was one of the chief preoccupations of the 20th century. When the century began, Britain was fighting in South Africa. In 1899, Dutch settlers had demanded independence from their British colonial rulers. But the Boer War was not the walkover that the British Army had assumed it would be. It took the British 3 years to secure victory in the world's first guerrilla war. On August the 4th, 1914, Britain declared war on Germany. Within a year, the British Army had more than doubled in size. The war that was expected to be over by Christmas would rage for 4 more years. By the end of the first month, the German army had swept over most of Belgium, and the French had been forced to retreat to the Somme, the last barrier before Paris. Along the Western Front, trenches stretched for miles, with the horror of no man's land separating the opposing armies. In April 1915, Allied forces landed at Gallipoli in Turkey in one of the most disastrous campaigns of the war. It was hoped the combined land and sea operation would knock the Turks out of the war, but as the Allied forces stormed the beaches, they found an army ready and waiting. "25,000 men died in the 10-month campaign before the Allied command ordered a retreat and evacuated the remaining troops. The long-awaited offensive on the Western Front finally began in July 1916. For the Battle of the Somme, Britain had assembled her largest army ever. Its objective was to take 4,000 yards of enemy territory in the first day. Along a 15-mile front, 26 divisions went over the top into no man's land. They were ordered to proceed at a slow walk. 1 soldier in every 6 died in the blackest day in military history. By the summer of 1918, the nature of war had changed. Planes were no longer simply used for reconnaissance. The war accelerated the development in aeroplane design, and by 1915 the Allies had perfected a way of connecting the trigger of a machine gun to the propeller, and the aeroplane became an effective killing machine. The greatest flying ace of them all was Manfred von Richthofen, the Red Baron. In less than 2 years of fighting, he had destroyed a record 80 Allied aircraft. His reign of terror in the skies finally came to an end in April 1918, when he was shot down during the Second Battle of the Somme. The war at sea was for a while dominated by the successes of the German U-boats, but in 1915 the British Navy scored a massive hit when they sank the German warship the Blücher, the most powerful battle cruiser in the world. At the time, it was the biggest ship of the war to be destroyed. At 11 a.m. on the 11th day of the 11th month, 4 years after the war began, the guns finally fell silent. 10 million men had died in the war to end all wars. A generation had been lost. In 1936, Spain was torn apart by civil war. The ideological beliefs of communism and fascism divided the country. From Germany, Hitler sent in the Luftwaffe to support General Franco's nationalist army. In 3 years of bitter fighting, 600,000 people died before Franco led his army into Madrid and assumed the reins of dictatorial power. By 1926, Italy had become a one-party state under the rule of Benito Mussolini. He had grand ambitions for his country, no less than the creation of a second Roman Empire. By 1939, Mussolini had allied his fascist government to that of that other great empire builder, Hitler. Italy and Germany were now committed to support each other in a time of war with all military force. Three months later, Hitler signed a non-aggression pact with the leader of the Soviet Union, Joseph Stalin. It ensured that neither country would join forces with another power in a hostile alliance against the other. 1 month later, Germany and Russia invaded Poland. The Second World War had begun. By the 16th of July 1940, Hitler had decided to invade Britain. The fight for control of the skies was crucial to victory for both sides. Hermann Göring, commander of Germany's Luftwaffe, promised to defeat the Royal Air Force in just a couple of weeks, and the battle for Britain was on. But by October, Germany had just 275 fighter planes left, compared to Britain's 732. By 1944, though, Germany had developed the first rocket-powered weapon, the V1, the Doodlebug.
The Prime Minister, accompanied by Mrs. Churchill, visits anti-aircraft gun sites which are tackling flying bombs. He wears the uniform of Colonel of the Royal Sussex Regiment, moving from battery to battery and hearing the scores recorded by gun crews. At one site, Mr. and Mrs. Churchill met their daughter Mary, who is in charge of the plotting by the ATS. Many people not in the south of England have yet to see and hear one of these missiles. Fighters of Air Defence of Great Britain get on the trail. Pathé cameraman Terry Ashwood photographs the kill. On the killing grounds in the south lie carcasses of flying bombs brought down by planes and guns. Bomber Command of the RAF, operating in strength in daylight, sends a force of Lancasters to smother a flying bomb site in France. Craters overlap from the terrific concentration of bombs sent down. Victims of Germany's new device are visited by the King and Queen. People who have been rendered homeless respond bravely to the royal concern in their suffering. The inmates at this rest centre have suffered much, but face their losses with infinite spirit. It is they and their like for whom the King and Queen express their deep and lasting admiration.
3 years after the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, the war in the Pacific finally turned in the Americans' favor.
In one of the most spectacular war scenes yet filmed, the first assault wave goes in under vicious fire from the enemy. The Americans press on through heavy punishment. Nothing can stop them now. The last 100 yards they wade ashore onto the Orote Peninsula. Along the coast, 10 miles away, the army is making similar landings under cover of a barrage from the fleet. Here, armor goes ashore almost without opposition. The Japs have been blasted off the map. The stars and stripes again fly over Guam, this time to stay.
On August the 6th, 1945, the Americans dropped an atom bomb on the Japanese city of Hiroshima. 3 days later, they dropped a second bomb on Nagasaki. Within 5 days, Japan surrendered and the Second World War was finally over. The atom bomb posed a new threat to mankind. His very survival was now in question.
As United States forces come more fully into action in support of the United Nations resolution, the Superfort crews are briefed for strikes to stem the advance of the North Korean tank spearheads. With bridges and mountain passes for their target, The giant bombers set out from Japan as directed by General MacArthur, fresh back from a daring flight to the front.
The Korean War was the first test of the post-war alliance. Southeast Asia had become an ideological battleground in the fight between democracy and communism.
The flames of war must be quelled in Korea before they spread beyond control.
But by 1963, the ideological conflict had spread to Vietnam. America committed her forces to support the South Vietnamese against the communist Viet Cong. Over 500,000 American troops were stationed in Southeast Asia at the peak of the conflict, but they suffered terrible losses against the guerrilla tactics of the Viet Cong. In America, public opinion turned against the Vietnam War. Despite her superior military hardware, America suffered a humiliating defeat, the scars of which have influenced American foreign policy ever since. 3 days after Argentina invaded the Falkland Islands, a British armada set sail to fight a war 8,000 miles away. It was a formidable display of British military strength. The Queen's son, Prince Andrew, was amongst those who went to fight. It took only 3 months for the British task force to recapture the islands and once again raise the Union flag over the capital, Port Stanley. But the Argentine Air Force had had devastating success with a new weapon, the Exocet missile. The development of guided missiles marked a new era in modern warfare. After a month of air attacks and a land war that lasted just 100 hours, Allied forces drove Saddam Hussein's Iraqi army from Kuwait. The success of the air bombardment and the use of so-called smart bombs kept Allied casualties to a minimum. In contrast, Iraqi losses were estimated at more than 200,000. The breakup of the former Yugoslavia in 1991 led to a bitter, long-drawn-out civil war. Throughout the last decade of the 20th century, the country was torn apart. Neighbours who had lived peacefully alongside each other for years became bitter enemies overnight. The tragedy of the former Yugoslavia is centuries old. It was compounded in the 20th century by the arbitrary redrawing of borders that failed to take into account ethnic differences. The killings and the tears in the Balkans are another stark reminder of the human cost of war.